Well, Pope Francis has managed to do something that few people, including myself, thought was possible. He managed to bring together the liberal-minded Catholics and the traditional-minded Catholics in a show of unity and of one mind that we haven't seen for a long time in the Church. He, in a recent interview, said something that all the various factions could agree was wrong. And the Holy Father seemed to admit that this was the case, that he had said something that wasn't phrased exactly the way he meant for it to be said. And this is something I can sympathize with the experience of saying something imprecisely because of the spontaneity of verbal communication. In my experience as a public communicator, there have been times at speaking events or even on my channel where my thoughts are a little more prepared, where I've said something that wasn't quite exactly how I intended it to be said, and therefore attracted some correction. Specifically, he was answering a question about whether certain behaviors of a sexual nature should be illegal or not, and he said that they were sinful but not criminal. And while his answer wasn't quite right, it does raise an interesting question. How do we determine when something isn't just immoral but should also be illegal? Now, obviously, you have to start by establishing whether something is immoral or not, and this is a question of objective truth, independent of our preferences and our legal systems. In Christian terms, you could say a thing is either a sin or it is not, based on the objective, natural, moral law. When something is objectively wrong, it will naturally have negative consequences which will result from choosing it. But whether or not something should be considered illegal is a matter of prudential judgment. That evaluation starts by recognizing that something is objectively morally wrong, and then it moves on to questions like, does it produce severely negative consequences for the person choosing it and for society? Is it pervasive in society? Are a lot of people doing it? And can it be corrected through punitive measures? And when considering the same moral act, there are times and places in which the answer to those questions is yes, and there are times and places in which the answer to that is no, which is why it becomes a matter of prudential judgment, and it requires that level of nuance. Rarely can you use absolutes like it should always be illegal or it should never be illegal, unless it is very clearly extremely immoral, like something like murder. And in order to make that evaluation, we need to be able to recognize that there are some moral truths that can be imposed through force of law and be beneficial to those that it's imposed on. But there are some moral acts that, if they are coerced by force from the outside, then they lose their essential moral quality and stop being beneficial to the one performing the act as well as to society. And between these two kinds of moral acts, if we're asking the question, can they be enforced by law? In the case of the former, it's always a possibility. They are always eligible to be enforced through the law. But in the case of the latter, the answer should always be no. So that this isn't all so remote and abstract and theoretical, let's look at some actual examples here. So let's look at the rules of a classroom, because we can all recognize that without rules in a classroom of kids, without some legal understanding that certain moral behaviors will result in punitive measures by the school, chaos and anarchy will consume the aims of education. So take, for example, speaking out of turn, because we all know someone who tends to dominate conversation, right? Someone who speaks over others, interrupts, and never gives other people a chance to contribute to the conversation. Now, we can all recognize this is immoral behavior. It's rude, it's inconsiderate, and it's dismissive of others. And this is something that clearly has negative consequences. It prevents the person who is dominating all the conversation from hearing what other people have to say and then therefore growing in understanding and knowledge for themselves. It also creates resentments among their peers because nobody likes to spend time with someone who is so self-involved that they won't listen to what anyone else has to say. But for a lot of people, they can't help themselves. This is a compulsive vice or bad habit, which can be corrected through the imposition of rules, like a teacher who imposes consequences if they don't raise their hand to speak in turn. And that imposition will help them to learn that it is good to listen and to give other people a chance to speak and to have patience before you just blurt out the first thing that comes into your mind. A rule that enforces speaking in turn, especially in a classroom setting, can help people who struggle to outgrow this kind of behavior, and it will obviously be beneficial to the classroom. This is an example of a moral proscription, which means it's an immoral behavior that we want to prevent. Speaking out of turn is bad. We've established a rule and a punishment for those who do it in order to correct that behavior and to create harmony in society and in the classroom. And I would say that anything that is proscriptive in this way is eligible to be enforced through coercion and punitive measures. If we can say we ought not to do it, then it is a candidate to be legislated against, whether it's in the classroom or in society at large. Now, then the other questions need to be addressed. If it's not a gravely immoral act, if it doesn't have serious consequences for the person doing it or for society, and if it isn't a big problem for society, there aren't a lot of people who are in the habit of doing it, then prudential judgment would probably say we don't have to make it illegal. But if the reverse is true, then it should be illegal. And obviously the punishment should fit the crime. If someone litters some garbage, they should get a fine. If someone kills someone, obviously more than a fine is appropriate. Now, for those who are Christian, we know that Christian morality goes a lot further than just telling us what we ought not to do. It also tells us what we ought to do. It tells us things like we need to care for the least among us, the widow, the orphan, the sick, the imprisoned, and the poor. It even tells us we ought to love our neighbor as ourselves, even our enemies. Now, notice that when Jesus introduced these teachings, he never said what the legal punishments should be for those who don't perform them. As was the case with the Old Testament teachings, they were imposed by force of law. But the teachings about Christian charity were never framed that way. The only consequence that Jesus identifies is the loss of the kingdom of heaven, which is the ultimate natural consequence. And the reason for this is that love, which is the key common ingredient to all of these teachings about Christian charity, has to be freely given in order for it to be love. In other words, you cannot coerce acts of love and have them remain acts of love. For example, my wife loves me and she married me, and that love brings me a great sense of satisfaction and fulfillment in my vocation because I know it's freely given. That's what makes it the treasure that it is. But if I or someone else forced her to marry me and to say that she loves me and to go through those motions when she doesn't, it wouldn't be the real thing and it wouldn't lead to that satisfaction and fulfillment. Instead, it would ultimately be a source of frustration and despair for both of us. If someone forces me to give money to a poor person out of the notion of Christian charity, it loses the quality of caritas or love that Jesus was trying to encourage. And this is why it should never be a product of coercion by force, and why Christians should never support such coercion as if doing so would be the fulfillment of Christ's teachings. So to summarize, moral proscription, that is, things that we ought not to do, can always be considered eligible candidates for legal enforcement as long as they fit certain other criteria that we discussed. But legal prescriptions that Jesus taught us about loving our neighbors can never be enforced by law without being stripped of the content of love. So, returning to the question of sexuality, if we determine that something is sexually immoral, and there are ways to determine that, then the answer is yes, of course, it can be eligible for legal restriction if the consequences are grave and a lot of people are doing them. And the way to know if it's immoral is by asking if a particular sexual act accords with the natural law. Does it fulfill what our sexual organs were clearly designed for? Because there's a lot of sexual behavior in this liberated world we live in that produces obviously negative consequences like disease and injury, often resulting in death. And in any other sphere of life, if something is unnecessarily putting lives at risk, we're pretty quick to jump in and throw masks on people and add legal restrictions. But with sex, we have this insane double standard where we say nearly everything is permissible. Take something like fraud, for example. If I sign a business contract in bad faith and I don't hold up my side of the agreement, especially if there are significant amounts of money involved, then I'm eligible for some serious legal consequences, maybe even jail time. We've all heard of white-collar crime. But if I enter into a marriage and I sign a contract in bad faith and I fail to uphold my promises by having an affair and causing a divorce, we look at that and say, that's fine, no-fault divorce. Now, why this double standard? They're both examples of breaking your word with severe consequences involved. We look at broken promises when money is involved as intolerable and it should be illegal. But broken promises to your family, Well, what can you do? Which is to say that in our society, we're more interested in protecting money than we are children and families. So no wonder we're in such a state. Sex should always be an act of love for the good of the people involved and for the good of society. And love means to will the good of another. It is to give of yourself for the sake of the other, often accompanied by qualities like commitment, responsibility, fidelity, as opposed to merely self-serving pleasure-seeking, which is antithetical to love. Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we internet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.